Well, you're not going to hear an expert like Kathy would have been for you, but anyway, I hope you have fun today. It's really strange that I'm doing this presentation because I was one of those people growing up that hated bugs. I was pretty squeamish around them. In fact, when I went to SAM and my minor was biology, I avoided every class I could with entomology. And that worked pretty good till I got to Dr. McLeod, and then he took us on multiple field trips. One way out, I don't know where, out close to the Trinity River, that was supposed to be primal land. We found the strangest insects I've ever seen in my life. We found a walking stick that was measured 10 inches long, and there was all kinds of, and hugest spiders I've ever seen. And so that helped me kind of get over this squeamishness a little bit. And of course, then I signed up for genetics. So I spent the summer with fruit flies. So anyway, Richard kind of caught me at a strange moment. My son was visiting, and he said, "Oh, Mom, you can do this. I will send you something." So I'll punch start, right, Richard? How many of you heard this? And he takes back the birds and the bees, the flowers and the trees, and things called love. Okay. Anyway, that's my son, and I just found out he and Monica worked at the same place for a while, although I think he must have followed Monica. We're not sure.
Decades before.
Well, I think y'all may have crossed paths at some time. But anyway, it's a sense of humor. So today we're not going to deal with sexual reproduction. We're going to try to stick with asexual reproduction and do pollination. So first we need to talk about, I chose to kind of do pollination rather than pollinators, but we will get into some pollinators. Pollination is very important to our strong, healthy ecosystem. In fact, 1 out of every 3 bites of food you take depends on pollination. And can you name any of these things that needed pollination here? Let me see if I can get this to work. Can you tell me what that one is? It's a lime. And then here we have beauty berries. And this one I took on a Master Gardener cruise.
Is that Luca?
Nope. It's a cacao. And it's very dependent upon, we'll find out in a little bit, upon pollination. Most of the world's flowering plants depend on hard-working insects and birds that we call pollinators, but these pollinators are in trouble. Without pollination, we are 1 plant generation away from losing some of these plants from our environment. So next is, what is pollination? It's an essential part of plant reproduction, and where the pollen is taken from a flower's anthers and rubs or drops onto a pollinator. Then the pollinator takes the pollen to another flower where the pollen sticks to the stigma, or the female part, and the fertilized flower yields fruit and seeds. At this time, I want you to take out your brown bag. We have some you should have some pipe cleaners, a yellow one, a black one, and then 2 small white ones. So we're going to make a pollinator. We're going to pretend we're junior master gardeners today. So just bear with me. That's my passion anyway, to do it. So first you're going to take the black one and the yellow one and wrap it around the finger. Wrap it around the finger. Any finger, any size you want. Now you've kind of got your bumblebee, except you're going to attach wings. Now I gave you 2. You can do a fake one and just use your white ones for one wing, or if you really want to be true to the bumblebee, you'll make 2 wings. And you'll attach it to your bumblebee. Just stick it in. It'll work if you just stick it in. It'll work. It's one of the characteristics of bumblebees, or bees. So anywhere it looks like it needs wings, okay? And then you have a little paper clip, and I don't have one in my bag, so if you want to attach your paper clip so you don't get burned or get stung, then you're going to lay out your paper towel, and you're going to lay out your flowers. And I need 2 lab assistants, so I'm going to choose you 2 right here, 2 lab assistants. Here's you some pollen, and here's you some pollen. Would you please go around and put pollen on everybody's red flower? On the red flower. And if you keep it on your towel, it'll be easier to clean up later. To keep your flowers on your towel, it'll be easier to clean up for us later. So we won't have to have somebody come back and clean later. About that much, but you're going to need both flowers out on the paper towel. However you want to do it, Monica.
Put this on both?
No, just on one, on the red one. Only pollen on the red one. These flowers didn't get to decide what gender they were. You got extra ones? That may have happened. You can put it anywhere you want so that the bee won't sting you. You're going to find out which go. And we're just doing a simulation that kind of shows that you could use in a classroom if you're with kids or whatever, that works really well. I think everybody has some pollen. If you need some more, just raise your hand and we'll get you some more pollen. The pollen is non-toxic. It's actually baking flour. So. It's not a pesticide or anything. So then you're going to do the simulation. You would start with the male flower with your pollinator and get you some pollen, and then go to your yellow flower and pollinate it. Go from the red one, which is the male, and go over and deposit your pollen on the other one. Y'all are good. Thank you for bearing with me. I'll wait for Monica to try hers and see if it works. You're going to pollinate your yellow flower. Thank you, lab assistants. It's just kind of a simple thing, and thank you for bearing with me, this elementary teacher today. Okay, so we've talked about what is pollination. So next we're going to do when it happens. And it happens mostly all year long. Of course, spring is the time that we have our early plants to provide food and nectar for our pollinators. We have bulbs, we have spring ephemerals like wildflowers that are blooming, and we have fruit trees that are blooming and are visited by our pollinators. In the summer, as our gardens get to their peak bloom, we know what happens. We get lots of pollinators to visit, don't we? Sometimes they're very destructive. But the long days of summer facilitate maximum time for the pollinators to gather food, for forage. In fall, I get this to go down on my notes. Be sure I'm right. Oh, here we go. Okay, now I know what I'm doing. Okay, late blooming plants provide pollinators before hibernation, and also before migration. So we know what's happening right now if you have feeders out for hummingbirds. There are a lot that are preparing. In the winter, even though there appears to be no activity from pollinators, you need to leave decaying plants alone. so that they can shelter these pollinators and insects. And we know that the butterflies are also getting ready to make their huge trek to Mexico. And then even there's different times of day. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Most of the time we think about pollinators being, we see them in the daytime. But pollinators are very busy at nighttime. I was very disappointed because usually every year I put 2 pots of pentas on my deck. And usually I'm visited by butterflies profusely. I didn't see any hardly at all. So I was very disappointed. Was it a different plant, a different species of that one, a different cultivar? What's going on? But then one night I slipped out, I went outside on the deck. My pentas were covered with moss. I read later that if you were to hang a white sheet somewhere outside at night, that within an hour you would have over 200 moths. So at nighttime, pollinators are still very busy. And then where do pollinators live? Okay, now how do I get to that one? The button?
No, the same button.
Oh, the same one. Okay. Charlene's not here, or she'd recognize this. How many of you been to the Nutcracker? Okay, what is it? It's being done by the Pentatonic, so it's not an orchestra. It's the waltz of the flowers. It's the waltz of the flowers, and I chose that one because the habitat of pollinators depends on their life cycle. For example, bees use leaves, mud, and plants and shells for and sometimes snail shells for their nest. While butterflies, larvae live and feed on specific plants. But pollinators need foraging habitat. And I often wondered, the plants and the blooming plants have ways to attract. And I often wondered if Tchaikovsky didn't watch flowers dancing to attract pollinators as he wrote Waltz of the Flowers. So I said, I'm just trying to have a little fun today with y'all. So anyway, that's where they could live. They need diverse nectar-producing species. Then who pollinates? And pollinators are an important part of our landscape, as we said. 90% of all flowering plants rely on pollination. Most pollinators, 95%, are insects. But I want to ask you, what trait do we as humans share with pollinators? Any guess? Anybody?
We stick our nose in other people's business.
Okay. Leave it to Tom Gimler, yes. What trait do we share with pollinators besides sticking our nose in other people's business?
Actually, I do some of my own pollination on my daily.
Yes, humans do pollinate, that's right, we do.
Yeah.
But how many of you grabbed a piece of candy? We like sugar, don't we? We all like sweet things, so that's the main thing that we share a trait with pollinators, is that we all like sweet things. Yes, we do. So our first one we're going to talk about, can you tell what this one is? All right, this is the honeybee. And they're probably our most famous. We're getting close back there. They're probably our most famous pollinators, but they like wildflowers and trees as well. In my landscape, one of the things they really like is my native vitex. When it blooms, it's not the prettiest bloom with the native vitex, but it will be covered with bees. So I'm sure a lot of us have different kinds of honey we prefer. Growing up, my dad had patches of red clover, and he had beehives until he couldn't have them anymore because of too many stings. But we love the red clover honey, but honeybees are one of our most popular ones. And this is one you made today, the Bumble Bee. They're just big and fuzzy like bees. And they feed on nectar. They are less likely to sting than honeybees. But if they do sting you, they may sting multiple times rather than once, like a honeybee. A honeybee will sting once and it's gone, but a bumblebee can sting multiple times. There are many kinds of bees, carpenter bees, leaf-cutting bees, and all kinds of other bees. I have to share a family story with you again. After I started to school, left home, my brother James, which you know, was quite a character, and my younger sister Ada were home. Well, they were roaming around the yard, which wasn't fenced, and found a bumblebee nest in the ground. So James had a challenge for my sister. Mother didn't know anything about this. They got a jar and a spoon, and Ada's job was to go to the hole and get the honey and bring it to the jar, which James was holding safely out of range. So anyway, that can happen, but anyway, that's just a story about James that we all enjoy. Okay, then this one, can you identify this one? It looks like the bee, but look at its wings. Only one wing. It's a hoverfly. And you've probably seen them and didn't realize you had seen them because they do mimic the bee and the wasp. They don't sting, but they have only one pair of wings. Now their larval stage is what's important to us, is because their larval stage lasts about 2 to 3 weeks, and during that time period, they can devour 400 aphids. So hoverflies are pest control as well as pollinators. I just thought that was an interesting to include. The next one we all love, of course, is the hummingbird. And they're just tiny. How many native hummingbirds do we have to Texas? Only 2. Only 2 are native. And that's the ruby-throated hummingbird and the rufous. And rufous is not as colorful, of course, as the ruby-throated hummingbird. We love their iridescence and we love to watch them. Right now, this morning, I made more pollinator nectar before I left because mine are empty this morning. So right now, since they're about to migrate, instead of the solution I use is 4 parts water to 1 of sugar. I've increased the sugar because they are about to migrate, so I increase it just a little bit to give them a little bit extra sugar for their migration. And then, of course, one of our favorites is the butterfly. And we're getting ready to do that butterfly garden soon. So they're all species, and they're wonderful pollinators in the garden. What is the only hazard to butterflies? The only hazard to our plants from having butterflies is their caterpillars. They will eat your plants up, so you need to be prepared. If you're going to have a species that attracts butterflies, then you need to be sure that you're willing to share that plant with their caterpillars. There's a list in your Master Gardener Handbook in the section on pollinators that list pollinators and specific plants. That's really helpful if you want to access that information that's in your handbook. And then this is a whole lot of pollen. And I borrowed this title from the recent publication of Texas Master Gardeners, so it's kind of helpful with me. It's on pollinators and bats. So it's really very helpful to me in preparing this. I've kind of picked some we don't like or that surprise us a little bit. So the first one I have is one that's really like us, that likes sweet things. It's attracted to everything. It's the ants. We even have a type of ant we call sugar ant that really gets, if it gets in the house, it's really going to be hard to get rid of. We know they are pollinators, but I really don't like to have some kinds of ants. I have a special aversion to leafcutter ants, which tend to inhabit my property. So I have to watch out for them, and I try to exterminate all of them. Sometimes it's hard to find their trail. I don't like sugar ants, and I don't like termites. So I have exterminators every quarter. But ants do pollinate for us. They're just the little ones we don't like especially. And then this one, especially like these either. We don't like the wasp either. But, and they behave a lot like bees, and they have the same diet as bees. They eat nectar, but that's not all they eat, of course. They do eat other insects. And you've seen them catch a spider or a web. But they do spread pollen, and they are important pollinators, but they're not as important as perhaps bees.
They'll stay on your feeders.
Oh, yes, they do. Yeah, they have a sweet tooth, definitely. They will raid the feeders. Yes, they will. Ants will too. Ants will too. Okay, and this one is the moss. As I said, there are night ones, and if you were to put out the white sheet, you would catch 200. And I was just really surprised. This one that I picked is called the Sphinx moth, or some people call it hummingbird moth. And the night I went out to see my pentas, there were many of them on the pentas, which was unusual to see them. I just froze in my footsteps to see them for just a little bit. But they were working diligently at night. They are attracted to night blooming flowers that have sweet scents. And they especially like lantanas. And then the next unusual one is the bat, and it is a pollinator. And they have several purposes. Carnivorous bats hunt insects such as moths, flies, and mosquitoes, but they don't interfere usually with our lifestyle. So they're usually welcome around the homes and gardens. Some people even have bat houses for bats to live in, for shelter for them. They hunt small mammals also, but they like fruits and vegetables and roots. And they do have a sweet tooth like we do. The fruit bat they're very important to the desert areas with cactus plants, because they pollinate the cactus flower, and then they return when the flower has made its fruit. Then they return and eat the fruit and then spread the seeds. So they're definitely a plus as far as our succulents and cactus production in the desert areas. And then another method of pollination doesn't rely on pollinators. This one is wind. And how many of you have ever done this? Made a wish and blow the dandelion seeds away as far as they can blow. But wind, it does pollinate a lot. There is one crop that farmers grow that is particularly dependent on wind pollination. Do you know what it is? Corn. It's corn, yes. It's corn. And again, I have to share another personal story with you. Years ago, my dad cleared an area of our property that's down by a branch that's named Buzzard Branch. I don't know why, but that's what it's named. It was very fertile soil, and he tested the soil. It would be right. He got his allotment for corn. He said, that's where the corn's going to be this year. So he planted the corn, and it grew over 6 feet tall. I remember as a kid running through those tall corn stalks. But a strange thing, we never got any corn. Never got any corn. It was down by the creek where the wind didn't get to it. It did not pollinate. Even though he planted the right number of rows to cross-pollination, the wind didn't happen. So wind is a very important method of pollination. So then what can we do to help pollinators? They are at risk. President Obama issued a memorandum in 2014 to create a federal strategy to promote health of honeybees and other pollinators. And also our Texas Parks and Wildlife, and Richard will show you a publication that's available on their website. And if you do wildlife management like I do, this would be a very useful publication for you about how to develop pollinators on your property. But Texas Parks and Wildlife is very active in promoting the health of pollinators. So we need to create a healthy habitat for our pollinators. And I forgot again, no. Okay. The first thing they need is we need to provide a diverse species of native and other plants. And in this publication, I didn't print it off for you, but if you're interested, there is a huge list of native plants for East Texas plains, of native plants that are good for pollinators. So if you want to find that and go search it out and print off that page for you, it's a huge publication, but you may want to pick and choose what you publish. So we need to supply food, and we need to provide water. Some beekeepers put out as much as 60 gallons of water a day so that their bees have enough water. But we need to be sure that our pollinators have a source of water. But as you're putting out water, of course, you need to be careful to empty it and keep it clean to avoid mosquito larvae from hatching. So then you need to provide shelter, and we talked about that. But one of the things with wildlife management that's in here that you can do, and it's a part of my report every year, is that I report how many brush piles I leave per acre and how many snags I leave per acre, so that you provide shelter for pollinators. So you can do that, and more of that information is in that publication. And then last of all, we need to be have responsible use of pesticides and herbicides. Because this is one of the main things I think is not just using it, but using it inappropriately. I think that's been a big issue. We just think it was a little bit, but a whole lot more will do better. So we need to use what the package directions require us to use and be responsible when we're using pesticides or herbicides. Then I couldn't resist this. So the pollinators don't like for the flowers to be too far apart. But this is from in each month in Texas Master Gardeners, Skip Richter does Ask Skip at the last page, and he always includes a cartoon. And this was his cartoon recently in one of the publications, and I couldn't resist it. I hope you've had fun today. I don't plan to be an entomologist. I never wanted to be, but I've enjoyed getting this presentation together, and I've learned a lot. I hope you just come away with an appreciation for pollinators and plan to do something that promotes their health in the property that you are responsible for.
Thank you.
So any questions? I probably didn't answer them, but anyway. And these are some of the resources I used in preparing this: was Texas Master Gardener, the Smithsonian Institute, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and Texas Master Gardener Handbook. Do we want to do a door prize? Are there any questions or comments?